You're so welcome back to another episode of Keeping It a Bean. This is my kind of at-home edition. These are just solo episodes that I just wanted to kind of play around with format wise and whatnot. Just kind of see like, all right, do I like this? Do I want to prefer studio type situation? But these are going to be episodes where I am just questioning some things that are going on in pop culture and really intellectualizing it a little bit, but also asking a bit more of a deeper question. And so, for those who are coming into the space and those who are new to me, my background is in theater studies. I was a dramaturg, which means I had to understand the political, cultural, economic analysis, what people were doing at the time, what was going on in order to inform the world of the theater. I also have a background in broadcast journalism, so I was able to really understand a little bit more of communication, but also how media functions and also journalistic integrity too, right? I know a lot of us as podcasters tend to give a little bit more of our opinions sometimes, depending on the type show that we are also doing. But I still believe that I have a bit of a social responsibility as it comes to my platform, and I would love to continue to kind of excel in that kind of space too, right? I really, really do appreciate the kind of space that I get to occupy. And again, there's space for everybody, right? But I know that I want to maintain a little bit more social responsibility in terms of how I approach my platform. So this is my way of really getting excited to go back into doing some more solo episodes, especially as it relates to what's going to be happening in more of the social and political space, but also where is culture really going? And I'm excited to get into this episode a little bit more. And so off rip, I named all of that good stuff, everything you can find in like the description box below. But we are going to be talking about brain rot being the 2024 Oxford Word of the Year. Okay. And it's a little wild up in these streets. I'm not going to hold because I'm also not surprised by this being a word. I thought it was going to be between demure and brain rot. And so when it happened, I said, oh, okay. But I do think there's actually a further conversation that needs to happen in terms of brain rot and Trump's election, plus the rise of the anti-intellectual movement that is going on as well. And so, if we want to just get from the get-go, all right. The first recorded use of brain rot dates much before the creation of the internet, for real, for real. It was written down in 1854 by Henry David Thoreau in his book Walden. So if any of y'all are some literary gurus out here, you already know, okay? I really appreciated that book. But in there, he is criticizing society's tendency to devalue complex ideas and also how this is part of a general decline in mental and intellectual effort. This is something where I'm just like, oh, as a teacher, yeah, it's something that I know I was finding myself a little bit more frustrated with because of we kind of be like, oh, there's a lack of rigor going on, right? But in reality, it's also just like there is this move away from critical thinking. And so part of this is also a societal issue, how some of us are politically approaching education as well, but then also just a general consensus of just like, don't like how the world is moving, right? And so there's a little bit of antagonism that's also happening in terms of those of us who are deemed as experts, intellectuals, whatever we want to deem it. But there has been a very public reaction, a negative public reaction to this term, right? And so I've been kind of questioning of like, why don't people like expertise anymore? Why are people so apprehensive to believe in it, right? And so I'm trying to kind of tease out a little bit more of what that is. And so even through a little bit of my findings, I wanted to talk around that a bit more. It's interesting because it led Thoreau to kind of ask this question, while England endeavors to cure the potato rot, will not any endeavor to cure the brain rot, which prevails so much more widely and fatally? And I think that just really takes this idea of like, where is this public health issue going? But also, can we look at the decline of intellectual effort that's happening, right? There is something to say around innovation is going down, intellectual rigor is going down, but also the whole relationship to education and pursuing something of being an expert, there's a bit of a tension happening here, right? And I believe that that has been trending a while. And for me personally, the first time that I'm personally witnessing this is living through Trump's election back in 2016. And so we've been trending in this direction for a while, but when I'm particularly going to focus on 2016 and all the way up to 2024. And I knew we was cooked when Trump got elected in 2016. I said something's going on here because I was on a college campus at that point, and that's a moment where I was just like, y'all voted for him? Y'all heard what he was saying, right? And something in my mind just could not compute that because I'm just like, there's no way that you're able to say that the people are eating cats, right? All of that to me just feels fantastical. It kind of feels out there, but the idea of fake news and not actually believing in climate change and not believing in vaccinations. And I know that's a personal decision for a lot of people, but there is something to say around the rejection of science and scientific movements, right? Especially as it relates to public health. There is something to say around DEI efforts being rejected. And I think as we are continuing witnessing the rise of Trump at such a higher rate, to me, it's actually scary. And I do believe that there is actual correlation between brain rot and how it became the word of 2024 and the anti-intellectual movement and how Trump is essentially a full-on manifestation of all of this. So in this episode, I'm really going to discuss the importance of analyzing and kind of interrogating the anti-intellectual movement, but it's also implications on our community as a whole and what we should be thinking around culturally too. Because once again, 2024 is here, and guess what happened almost 10 years later? Trump's back in office. Right? That to me is wild. And so I think it's always important for us to just level set. And so I think it's important for us to kind of understand brain rot in its terms. Okay, so when you look at the definition of brain rot, it is the supposed deterioration of a person's mental and or intellectual state, especially viewed as a result of overconsumption of material. And now, particularly, they're going to be focusing a little bit more on the online presence of everything, which I think is it makes this relevant in terms of how we are witnessing a generation of kids who came up with iPads in their hand and only know iPhones, right? And that idea of us telling people you need to go touch grass. All of this to me, it comes together and it all correlates, right? And it's also content that feels trivial, but it's not challenging. AKA, what this definition is telling you is that y'all just watching nonsense. We all participate in some way, shape, or form, but it's a matter of what happens when things are overconsumed and things to kind of signify what brain rot could look like or behaviors that we should be noticing. There's a little bit of mental fogginess that occurs with it. There's a laziness, the reduced attention span, and a cognitive decline that results from the overabundance of screen time. Another idea of what brain rot behaviors can look like is doom scrolling, which, for those who need a definition, it involves long periods of searching for negative and distressing news online, or honestly, you just end up doom scrolling for a long period of time. One time, you know, it's 7 o'clock. Next thing you know, it is 10:30 a.m. And you're like, how did I spend 3 hours on this phone? And I go, hold. It's happened to me before. I've stopped getting ready for work just to sit there and scroll, right? It's something that we're all susceptible to. It's just a matter of how are you willing to manage it. So this is the idea of when people are deciding to take social media breaks. The idea of when people are just like, yeah, I don't feel good after using social media for a long period of time, right? People want to be able to curate their online experience into one that doesn't necessarily feel negative all the time either. And so I think all of this really plays a role into it because we see there are people who want to actively combat it, but also there's also another set of people who are also just like, yeah, dog, I'm gonna keep doing this because I have students and young people around me who are also just like they willingly engage with brain rot on the regular. And to me, I'm like, so you know what you're doing, but you continue to do it anyways. And I think it says something because there's also a active participation in doing this. And my question is like, is it just something that became almost compulsory? What maybe. Did I use that word right? Yeah, there's a compulsory action to it. I feel like I'm pronouncing that right, but we out here. Okay. Either way, it's almost habitual that it's second nature to them. But something that I found particularly interesting is when they discussed how the word brain rot became the word of 2024. And I thought it was interesting because the president of Oxford Languages, Caspar Grathwohl, said, It's been insightful and deeply moving to see language lovers all over the world participate and help us select the Oxford Word of 2024. Looking back at the Oxford Word of the Year over the past 2 decades, you can see society's growing preoccupation with how our virtual lives are evolving, the way the internet culture is permeating so much of who we are and what we talk about. Last year's word, Riz, was an example of how language is increasingly formed, shaped, and shared within online communities. Brain rot speaks to one of the perceived dangers of virtual life and how we are using our free time. It feels like the rightful next chapter in the cultural conversation about humanity and technology. It is not surprising that so many voters embrace the term, endorsing it as our choice this year. I find it fascinating that the term brain rot has been adopted by Gen Z and Gen Alpha, those communities largely responsible for the use and creation of the digital content that the term refers to. These communities have amplified the expression through social media channels that the very place said to cause brain rot. It demonstrates a somewhat cheeky self-awareness in the younger generations about the harmful impact of social media that they've inherited, which is why I find it fascinating that, and why I asked that question, like there's almost a willful participation that happens along with brain rot. People know what they are watching. And I've listened to some of my students say, yeah, I just kind of go through it and yeah, I just scroll through a bunch of brain rot. And I'm like, dog, read a book. What are you doing? Do something educational to like flex your brain a little bit. But there is almost like a comfort. And I'm wondering if brain rot is also part of this escapism that people want to engage in a little bit more. So this could be different. It comes in different forms, but I'm looking at brain rot specifically. But some of us do it in terms of going out. Some of us have our vices that we engage in. Some of us smoke. Whatever that thing is, we'd use it to escape this reality because honestly, the world is not a fun place to live in right now. It's actually very depressing, okay? And I'm really worried around the state of people's mental wellness and well-being and the overall public health of the space that we're in. And those are things that I continuously am thinking about as it relates to this growing use of brain rot, but also are we escaping so much that we no longer want to challenge? We no longer want to have critical thought because critical thought then makes us responsible for the world around us. And I've witnessed so many different people in so many different iterations also just say ignorance is bliss. Mhm. Like there's a unwillingness to want to participate in the world because when you see how the world moves, you now want to be inspired to change it or you run away from that responsibility. And I do think part of this anti-intellectual movement is this idea that we are moving into much more of a hyper individualist space, but also it's a combination of so much catastrophe has happened over the last decade that people are just simply trying to get by. People don't have the time to think about community in different ways. People don't have time to want to become experts in things. And so I think there's all kind of plays a role into it. And so though I am currently critical of what brain rot is doing, I can understand how we may have gotten there. And I want to continue on because I think it's important for us to continue one to level set. So far we've seen the origins of brain rot, but then also contextualizing it today. But I wanted to make sure that I laid the groundwork for that because it then moves into this anti-intellectual movement. And quick, we love some good definitions every once in a while. So when you look at the definition of anti-intellectualism or a person who participates in anti-intellectualism is a person opposed to or hostile towards intellectuals and the modern academic, artistic, social, religious, and other theories associated with them. This is essentially a person who believes that intellect and reason are less important than actions and emotions in solving practical problems and understanding reality. Now, when I look at that definition, I'm like, dog, this has quite literally been my criticisms of how people decided that they wanted to vote for Trump. And I connected that idea because we're living in a space where being progressive is still not a popular politic. And I wanted people to like understand a progressive politic is not a popular one, despite us benefiting from progressive politics, right? And I think about it because a couple weeks ago, I got to witness Angela Davis and a couple other Black Panthers speak on stage. And they said, we are part of the reason that people are able to sit here in this room today. And I think it's important for us to be able to honor our ancestors who are still alive that have given us some of these freedoms and have fought for those freedoms as well. And that it grounded me in a particular kind of way because I'm sitting there and I'm just like, dog, we're watching living history. I'm sitting in this seat because they fought, they pushed against, they agitated, they understood a system that was not meant for black people. That's That's important, dog. Like that historical context matters because I think oftentimes when we lose that historical context and how young that history is, we don't even realize the fruits of our labor today. And it's something that I'm also realizing is that we're getting further and further disconnected from civil rights. And I look at this because I'm just like, yeah, academics do matter. Artists are going to matter even more in this time because they are going to be able to reflect our stories. They reflect our pain. They're the emotional appeal that we need in order to sustain as a Black community, right? Social progression matters. This is how feminism rises when we are also thinking around ensuring that trans folks, non-binary folks are also being taken care of. Black people are being taken care of. This idea of belonging is happening for all people. But I do think the rejection of intellectualism is because people want to return to the status quo. By returning to the status quo, then that means you can aspire to what a Trump represents, right? Let me take a little sippy sip because I'm getting a little parched. Because Trump represents this idea of traditional white patriarchal values, money, power, land owning, successful man. Right, right, white. You know what I said. Okay. But even in that pursuit, he also represents an anti-establishment. He represents somebody who is willing to shift away from this expertise. Because again, these experts that we are talking around in terms of politics have the ability to control our material conditions. People are not satisfied with the ways in which that they are living right now. So because of that, there's much more of an emotional response that happens. And that's what I've been thinking around in terms of like how voters can move to a Trump, right? They are tired of a status quo. They are tired of these experts because oftentimes they look at these experts as not having a direct correlation, not directly, excuse me, taking care of them. They look at the Democratic Party and they're like, y'all so committed to this institution that y'all not even responding to the pains that people are having on the ground, working people are having on the ground, and they are asking for you to be better. So what happens when you are consistently being hit by the slow drip of capitalism and then recognize in that same breath, the other person must be better. Something else must be better than what we have right now. And it's not the first time that something like this has happened. I'm going back to 2016. But COVID-19 exacerbated this in a very different way. Among lingering effects of COVID-19 pandemic, most likely to affect population health is a decline of trust in science and in scientists themselves. A November 2023 poll by the Pew Research Center found that the percentage of Americans who said they had trust in scientists dropped from 87% at the beginning of the pandemic to 73% in 2023. The percentage of people who claimed little or no trust in scientists jumped from 12% to 20% over the same 27% over the same time span. Words. And so I think it's also interesting because I correlate it to Matt Mata. He is the author of Anti-Scientific Americans. And I think it's interesting because he began writing this book, Anti-Scientific Americans, after becoming increasingly concerned about the anti-intellectual rhetoric on the campaign trail in 2016, which he contends eventually degenerated into outright derision towards scientific experts. He is most worried about the disparaging language and dismissive tone used by politicians was becoming useful in appealing to the public and creating an opening for those politicians to undermine the role that experts play in effective policymaking. Again, experts in this field who are trying to progress life are now the people who are being attacked in this moment. Because guess what? If I can attack this quote unquote experts and my base is still leaning into it, that shit over and over again, bro. I'm gonna keep doing it because at this point, I'm getting my dopamine hit. It's the same way to me the algorithm works. Once you like one thing of a dancing video, you're gonna see the exact same dance come around and around and around and around and around again. And I've witnessed this happen. I'm like, oh, the algorithm is now gonna feed you, force feed you one thing over and over again. Trump pulled a very similar play. His play was to continue to just say fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news, fake news. Oh, if you are a black judge, you should not probably judge other black people because guess what? You'll probably be too partial towards them, right? As if white people don't do that, first and foremost. But that's besides the point. But it is this idea that there is a lack of rationality within black folks or people of color or whoever else that he decided was too much in DEI. He was able to play on that because that means if I can attack your credibility, it makes me seem more trustworthy. Despite what research can tell you, despite what anything can tell you, I am more trustworthy than the person who has this expert experience because honestly, he was really cooking niggas. I ain't gonna hold. And it was so annoying to witness, and it worried me so much. But Mata continues on, and he says, it's not just empty rhetoric that's thrown around on his campaign trail. If members of the public believe it, then politicians have an incentive to cater to it because they want to be reelected. It's that algorithm over and over again. He's playing into his base. He's great at marketing. And he continues on and says, and I fear that what we saw in the first Trump presidency, especially in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, in many ways, I would say the pandemic was the encapsulation of many fears that I had going into writing this book. And so he is somebody who's been studying this for a while now, right? And he talks around the Tea Party as being somebody who is also on the rise of this when it came to Obama. They didn't trust his ideas on the climate change that was going on and the ultimate climate catastrophe that was going to happen. They didn't want to do that. But also, don't have this nigga be smarter than you. What in the degrees got to do anything? Harvard, who cares, right? And so we're seeing like there's this goalpost that continues to move because if you have a black person who is in power and has a lot of expertise, then he clearly cannot be trusted versus this white person who has no allegiance to politics, who has no necessary expertise in whatever he's doing. But hey, I trust him more than an established quote unquote expert. I think that's very telling. Now, I do think that there are like modern contributing factors that play along into the anti-intellectual sentiments. And so we can really just talk around the rise of social media influence. People are now following people that they like. I want to follow an opinion that I agree with. I don't want to have to consistently be feel dysregulated because what's this person talking about? Do they know what they're talking about? I don't know if they know what they're talking about. I don't agree with them, so I'm not even going to act like it matters, right? That's the part of the social media influence piece. But then, and it's something I have to internalize, and that's why even at the beginning I front loaded. I want my platform to be have a level of social responsibility as I am approaching topics like this. Granted, if you see my content, I'm interviewing people, I'm talking to people, and I've leaned into much more of like the life and storytelling aspect of things. But this one, I really also find it important to have educational platforms, or at least platforms that can analyze how culture is moving. And I think pop culture really does inform how society is, what direction we're leading into, right? Because I think our reactions to pop culture phenomenons are also indicative of what we think around women, what we think around music, what we think around politics, what we think about art, what we think about education, all of these things. How the general public react to a Megan Thee Stallion is important to see. How do we look at Black women? And so whenever you're thinking around my lens of how I'm talking about things, that's how I utilize pop culture to then surface a conversation around this, which is why I believe social media influence is playing a significant role in brain rot, compiled with the algorithm. It is leaning on what are people going to engage with the most? People engage in stuff that feels like it's combative. People want something that puts their system in distress. People like drama. People don't want to have to sit there and look at a mirror and be like, oh, this is me. I now have to do something to change. That's why people avoid specific content. That's why it actually does not get fed in the algorithm a lot more. FD signifier talks about this. Foreign talks around this. Consciously talks about this. Olay talks about this. A lot of us are talking around it, especially if we're in the space of wanting to progress culture, right? I think that piece is important in terms of like how social media influence happens because if they're going to continue to rise up on those negative points, people will always go to that. The next piece is the misinformation and disinformation being spread across all social media platforms. So no matter what, people are able to know that on anybody's social media platform, we are all subject to whatever they choose to promote. Twitter would shadow ban my content. Instagram will shadow ban my content. Now, we still live there because a lot of my audience lives there. But the reality is, until I get that site and I can get a critical mass of my audience to visit my personal website, that's a way I have to continue to drive traffic to them. So it feels like a conundrum piece as well. But these social media sites are also peddling mis and disinformation and is targeted mostly at Black people. That's important to know. Black people are going to be the most it's going to be directed towards them, but everybody's still susceptible to it, right? That's important to know. But it's also this is what causes the distrust in experts and institutions. All of these play a role in terms of how the digital, how people choose to receive information now, but also the distrust and mistrust in experts and institutions all play a role into each other. And that's why I truly, truly believe that brain rot embodies a lot of these intellectual attitudes because people no longer crave curiosity, community, nor do they want to be challenged. I'm hard at it, don't. But if you give me a good intellectual challenge, I want to learn more. I want to be able to know that my opinion is not the strongest one in the room, or I'm not the smartest person in the room all the time. Now, a nigga smart. We're gonna keep that. And I love being a student of life. But this also means that new information and complex ideas are so much more difficult for people to understand and deal with, which makes intellectualism feel inaccessible and means there's no space for people to want to learn anymore. I truly, 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 truly believe in my heart of hearts that people want to learn. It's just that people are learning differently. But I don't think people have had the actual real life experience to know what it means to be challenged in a different kind of way. And that's what I hope that we are able to start doing more and more of because intellect should be accessible for everybody. It's a matter of people also wanting to push themselves. So I believe that the recurrent content that the algorithm that the recurrent content that algorithm is feeding people plays a significant role in how we are viewing work. And it concerns me sometimes even as an educator. I have fully experienced students participate in brain rot and name this brain rot that they are watching, and they are aware of what they're doing, and it just seems like they don't care. It makes me wonder, one, what does this mean for me as an educator and even as an English teacher? I couldn't read full pages without having to stop and ask questions and recap what's going on to ensure that everybody knows. That actually makes the reading experience much more condensed. It's still a good learning experience, but it means that they can only chunk the information in small bites in order to learn. And to me, that it was a frustration and a tension point that I have as an educator because I wanted them to be able to listen, sit with longer information and be able to connect these ideas and themes and dialogues and all of this. But knowing I had to break it down in a very different way, I'm like, oh, why are we learning like this? We should be able to sit with large amounts of information, right? But part of the science of teaching is knowing how to meet your students where they are at and ensure that though I may want them to learn one way, if a critical mass of students are not learning in that way, I can't approach education in that way either. And again, this is also understanding that there are kids who are being simply taught to a test because funding is also dependent on some of these tests and making sure that they pass. And so I do think some of it plays a significant role in terms of how students are choosing to digest information, but not only just digest that information, it is how we are showing there's a reward for it. So if you continue to do these reps over and over again until you get it right, I'm not actually teaching you to critically engage with anything. I'm teaching you to find the right answer and fail through it in order to get the response that I need you to have, right? That means there is only one way that this information can happen. But this is when teachers have to go with a much more inquiry-based approach. How did you think to get to that information? How did you get here? Can you explain your thinking to me? By asking those questions and asking it from a space of curiosity, it then forces a student to be able to expand their thought. You can appreciate how that they got there, but I do think like part of that feels like a tug for students and provides tension for students because they are not often met with how did you get that answer? I'm gonna call you wrong, but I want to know how you got there because at least we can identify where did your line of thinking go. I can appreciate, but we're gonna make sure that you can redirect and get to that answer too. And I think that's an important piece because that skill set right there, not everybody has. A lot of young people don't want that skill set. A lot of people my age don't want that. A lot of people older than me don't want that. One, keep them damn schools open, okay? As much as we can, because we're going to struggle if they try to pass this whole elimination of the Department of Education type situation. It's okay. I think around the negative attitudes towards intellectuals and scientists and credentialed experts, it's also what fuels people's opposition to the role that experts play in policy making. People don't like them because experts are still people, and there is a dislike of policy experts. And so, even if you think around the type of people who are averse to experts in education, they're also voters. They are also people. They are also those with loud ass mics and tend to be the ones who are even louder. And this is what Matt Mata says. The types of people who are averse to the role that experts play in policymaking process then may come to harbor some resentments on a very personal level towards those individuals. I personally found that interesting because that shit is so true. I have seen a rise of people who are questioning expertise, students who are just like, well, Mr. Richards, do you even know everything? I'm like, child, no. But I can tell you about this book. I can tell you about literature. I can tell you about this because I know I'm good at that. I studied this. It's my profession. Right? And I think that piece is interesting because I do invite curiosity and skepticism. And sometimes two plus two is only four. That will always be true. You know? So I think there's just objective truths that people tend to ignore as well. But it does feel deeply personal when there's someone who has controls over your policy, over policies, which in fact have control over your livelihood. And so I do think it goes back to this idea that people need a sense of community, people need a sense of connection. And oftentimes, those of us who are in academia, or those of us that are claimed to be intellectuals and claim to have that role, we got to be among the people more. You got to be where the niggas are. Because if you're not, people aren't going to trust you. I know that the people around me in my neighborhood, and I can walk down, talk to the niggas on the stoop, talk to people at my workplace, wherever the case may be. And there's a level of trust there because they not only see my actions not only exist in theory and just on this, but also in practice. My work is in practice. And I think that is a space where things need to be connected because oftentimes we don't realize and appreciate what people have done for us. And I don't think we're going to fully appreciate it until we are forced to depend on community and each other in a particular kind of way that Trump is going to force us to have to, because civil liberties are going to be taken away. The little things that we get to do every day, the privileges that we have of today, are not going to be something that we have moving forward. And we need to be prepared for what that means for women, queer folks, black people, people of color, immigrants, anybody who is not a cis white male, a rich cis white male, middle class cis white male, even poor cis white males. All of that plays like a very significant role. I think this is where the breakdown of community continues because there's not a space for healthy discourse. They have an algorithm that is feeding you the exact same thing. And I do believe that the role of online platforms continues to shape the way that we are seeing any form of expertise. People gravitate towards who they like. They do not gravitate towards people who are right. Ooh, that was a bar. Stop playing with me. Stop playing with me. And it's to little shit too, bro. Like I'm looking at the professional dancers who have to dumb down their choreography to appeal to a public response. The actual dancer versus the TikTok dancer consistently wins, right? People loving the rise of lazy and accessible singers. Shit, even if we get to, sorry, Taylor, you're catching a stray, but Taylor and Beyonce, number one and number two greatest pop stars. However, it's insane to think around this almost 30-year career being compared to Taylor. That to me just does not make sense, right? But again, Kamala versus Trump. There was a clear indicator of a person who was a much better candidate, but because what they represented as the establishment, what they represented as the intellectual, the theorist, Trump was a direct difference for that. And again, Trump was able to appeal to feelings and acknowledge those feelings and affirm those frustrations and knew who to place the blame on. We also needed somebody to blame. So I think this is how we end up getting a Trump. Now, granted, I ain't putting that on us. It's not going on us at all. Okay, black people, we good. We here. But everybody else, right? And again, it is still white people's fault that Trump was elected. Point blank period. They are the largest electorate, and so we do need to make sure that we are holding them to account and not being so quick to point fingers at everybody else because we need somebody to blame. Now, I do think that we need to continue to be intentional around how we have to build community and still protecting our own spaces, but also understanding that even us as black folks can't defeat white supremacy on our own. We make up 13% of this country. That's a reality. So, yes, we're allowed to be frustrated. And I do think that we need to continue to think around how to continue to build this community because I do believe the rise of the anti-intellectual movement is the reason that we got so many consequences that we have now. And I don't think that we need to reap those consequences for everybody else's lack of common sense, right? And that's not saying that niggas are always smart because some of y'all niggas, I'd be like, wow. But I am going to say that brain rot is something that we should be looking at. Brain rot is something that we should be looking at as almost a public health issue and recognizing that we should also just make sure that we're taking care of our children. We're taking care of our next generation. So those of us who are in education, those of us who are in mentorship, those of us who just simply want to see the world be a better place. I do think that we should see the role that brain rot is playing in terms of the rise of the anti-intellectual movement, not only the rise of the anti-intellectual movement, the we should all look at how brain rot is playing a role in the anti-intellectual movement, the dissolving of community, but also increasingly having this hyper individualist nature as well. Because if I am an expert and I can tell you why something is happening and have dictate and can dictate over somebody's livelihood, there is less of a chance that I'm going to have control, right? Or have trust. And so I just really wanted to sit in this episode and really just think around like how brain rot is functioning, what we should be concerned around, the anti-intellectual movement and all that good stuff. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I'm excited to kind of do a little bit more. I would love to hear you sound off in the comments below. Do you think brain rot has a correlation to the anti-intellectual movement? Does brain rot concern you? Should we be putting these social media platforms, should we be more responsible what that looks like? Are you going to become a toxic black excellence parent and not have your kids touch no technology until you're 14? Let me know in the comments below. I appreciate y'all rocking with me for this episode. And I'll see you next time. Peace.